The day I inherited 5,000 acres of Texas desert land from my grandfather, my mother-in-law, Margaret Wellington, nearly choked on her afternoon tea. We were sitting in her carefully manicured garden, surrounded by the trappings of old money that the Wellingtons had cultivated for generations. Desert land? She scoffed, dabbing her lips with a monogrammed napkin. Sarah, darling, you can't be serious about keeping that worthless dirt. What would people think? I'm Sarah Chen, and at 32, I'd spent the last 5 years trying to fit into the Wellington family's world of country club memberships and charity galas. My husband Thomas, bless his heart, came from the kind of money that never needed to talk about itself. But his mother made sure everyone else did. Actually, I said quietly, smoothing my dress, I think Grandpa Jack knew exactly what he was doing when he left me that land. Margaret's perfectly penciled eyebrows arched higher. Your grandfather was a ranch hand, dear. What could he possibly know about valuable property? What Margaret didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my grandfather hadn't just been a ranch hand. He'd been the smartest man I ever known, working the land for 40 years while quietly studying geology in his spare time. The land he left me hadn't been chosen at random. I think I'll hold on to it, I said, taking a sip of tea. For now. Thomas, sitting beside me, shifted uncomfortably. He'd always tried to play peacemaker between his wife from a modest background and his blue-blooded family. Mother, Sarah's grandfather, just passed away. Perhaps we could discuss this later. But Margaret Wellington wasn't finished. She turned to her husband, Charles, who sat engrossed in his financial papers. Charles, tell her. Tell her what worthless land does to a portfolio. Charles barely looked up. Listen to Mother, Sarah. Carrying costs on useless property can be devastating. Taxes, maintenance, liability insurance. Better to sell it quickly and put the money into something sensible. I'm sure we can find a buyer who'll take it off your hands for a fair price. A fair price. I suppressed a smile, remembering my last conversation with Grandpa Jack, just 2 weeks before he passed. They'll try to take it from you, sugar, he'd said, his weathered hands gripping mine. They'll call it worthless, try to shame you into selling. But you remember what I taught you about reading the land. Remember those summer nights when we studied geological surveys? I did remember. While other teenagers were at the mall, I'd spent my summers with Grandpa, learning about rock formations, mineral rights, and the secrets that lay beneath the Texas soil. He taught me everything he'd learned in his decades of self-study, showing me how to read the land like a book. The paperwork's all in order, he continued, pulling out a thick folder. Every survey, every mineral rights document, every piece of evidence. Keep it safe, and whatever you do, don't tell them what you know. Not until the right moment. Now, sitting in Margaret's garden, I watched her exchange knowing looks with her social circle, other wealthy women who'd gathered for their weekly tea. Their whispers weren't quite quiet enough to miss. Poor Thomas, married into such embarrassing circumstances. Desert land. How quaint. She really doesn't understand our world, does she? Thomas squeezed my hand under the table, his silent way of apologizing for his family's behavior. He was a good man, but he'd never quite learned to stand up to his mother. That evening, at another mandatory family dinner in the Wellington mansion, Margaret launched her next offensive. I've taken the liberty, she announced, passing a business card across the table, of contacting Harrison Reynolds. He's a wonderful real estate agent who specializes in disposing of unfortunate properties. He can handle everything discreetly. I pocketed the card without looking at it. Thank you, but I'm not interested in selling. Sarah, Margaret's voice took on the sharp edge I'd come to know well. You're being stubborn. That land is a liability. What could you possibly want with 5,000 acres of nothing? I thought about the geological surveys hidden in my grandfather's folders, about the specific coordinates he'd marked, about the oil company representatives who'd been quietly buying up surrounding properties over the past year. Sometimes, I said, cutting into my roast beef, nothing can be worth quite a lot. Margaret's fork clattered against her plate. Charles, you need to speak to your son. This obstinance is becoming embarrassing. The Wellingtons have a reputation to maintain. Charles Wellington finally looked up from his ever-present financial documents. Sarah, let's be practical. That land has no agricultural value, no development potential. It's a money pit. I'll make you an offer myself, $100,000. More than generous for worthless desert. I nearly laughed. The mineral rights alone were worth hundreds of times that, but they didn't need to know that. Not yet. That's very kind, I replied, but I think I'll keep my grandfather's legacy. The next few weeks were a parade of helpful suggestions and thinly veiled insults. Margaret invited me to lunch with her friends, all of whom happened to have brothers or cousins in real estate who'd be happy to help. Thomas came home with stories about investment opportunities his father had suggested once we liquidate that land. Even my sister-in-law Victoria got in on the act. "Sarah, darling," she cornered me at Sunday brunch, "you're not still holding onto that desert property, are you? It's becoming quite the topic at the club. People are concerned." I bet they were, especially since some of those same people had been quietly trying to buy up land in the area through shell companies. My grandfather's research had been thorough. He tracked every purchase, every shell company, back to their sources. But the real pressure started when Thomas came home one evening looking worried. "Dad's concerned about the family's reputation," he said carefully. "He thinks holding on to undeveloped land makes us look unstable. He's offering to bring me in as junior partner at the firm. But I need to sell the land first." I finished for him. He had the grace to look embarrassed. It would smooth things over. I took his hand, leading him to my home office, the one room Margaret hadn't been allowed to redecorate. Opening my grandfather's safe, I pulled out a single document. "Read this," I said. "But you have to promise to keep it to yourself. For now." His eyes widened as he scanned the preliminary geological survey. "Sarah, this shows." "Exactly," I said quietly. "Now you know why Grandpa Jack was so specific about which acres he bought, and why certain people are so eager to get their hands on it." Thomas sat heavily in my office chair. The family dinners, the constant pressure to sell. "They don't know what's under that worthless land," I confirmed. "Not yet, but some people suspect. That's why they're trying so hard to get me to sell cheap." "What are you going to do?" I smiled, thinking about all the lessons my grandfather had taught me about patience, about waiting for the right moment. "I'm going to let them keep thinking it's worthless for a little while longer." But events were about to move faster than even I had planned. The next morning, my phone rang, a call that would change everything. "Mrs. Wellington?" A crisp voice said. "This is Marcus Chen from Lone Star Energy. We'd like to discuss your property." Marcus Chen from Lone Star Energy wasn't just calling about my land. He was calling with an offer. A significant one. "Mrs. Wellington, our preliminary survey suggests your property sits on one of the largest untapped oil reserves in West Texas. We'd like to offer you $50 million for the mineral rights." I smiled, thinking of Grandpa Jack's meticulous research. "That's an interesting starting point, Mr. Chen. But I think we both know the actual value is significantly higher." There was a pause on the line. "You're aware of the geological surveys." "My grandfather didn't just work the land, Mr. Chen. He studied it. Every formation, every layer. I have all his research, including data about the surrounding properties your company has been quietly acquiring through shell companies." Another pause. "Perhaps we should meet in person." "I agree, and I'd like to host this meeting at my in-laws' house. They've been very interested in my property's value." 2 days later, I sat in the Wellingtons' formal living room, surrounded by my husband's family. They thought I finally agreed to discuss selling the worthless land. Margaret was practically glowing with satisfaction. "Sarah has finally come to her senses," she announced to the room. "Mr. Reynolds is on his way to handle the sale." Right on cue, the doorbell rang, but instead of Harrison Reynolds, Marcus Chen walked in, accompanied by 2 other executives from Lone Star Energy. Margaret's smile faltered. "I'm sorry, who were you?" "Marcus Chen, Chief Acquisition Officer for Lone Star Energy," he replied, setting his briefcase on the antique coffee table. "We're here to discuss Mrs. Wellington's property." Charles Wellington straightened in his chair. "There must be some mistake. Sarah has agreed to sell that worthless desert land to—" "Worthless?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Wellington, are you aware that your daughter-in-law's property sits on approximately 300 million barrels of recoverable oil?" The room went completely silent. Margaret's teacup clattered against its saucer. "That's impossible," Charles sputtered. "We had that area surveyed years ago. There's nothing there." I pulled out my grandfather's folders. "You had the wrong areas surveyed, Charles." Grandpa Jack spent 40 years studying that land. He knew exactly which acres to buy. Marcus nodded. Mr. Jack Chen was well known in geological circles, though few knew he was just a ranch hand. He contributed to several major surveys under a different name. Chen? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Your grandfather was a brilliant man who understood both land and human nature. I finished for her. He knew exactly what he was doing when he left me that property. Marcus opened his briefcase. Our initial offer is $50 million for the mineral rights alone. However, given the extent of the deposit and current market conditions, we're prepared to negotiate. Charles Wellington's face had turned an alarming shade of red. 50 million? All this time? And that's just the starting point, I added calmly. Wouldn't you agree that's a bit more than your generous offer of $100,000, Charles? Victoria, my sister-in-law, actually gasped. 100,000? Dad, you tried to buy it for. Now let's not get emotional, Charles started, but I cut him off. Actually, let's discuss emotions. Let's talk about the weekly humiliation at family dinners, the constant pressure to sell, the attempts to manipulate my husband with job offers tied to my cooperation. I turned to Margaret. The whispers at your garden parties about the embarrassing daughter-in-law who doesn't understand value. Marcus Chen cleared his throat. Perhaps we should schedule another meeting, when family matters have been settled. No need, I said firmly. The family should hear this. Your company has been buying surrounding properties through shell companies for the past year. Properties that my grandfather's research shows have significantly less oil than my land. You've paid an average of $30 million per parcel. I pulled out more documents. Given the relative deposit sizes, I think we should start negotiations at $200 million. Marcus didn't even blink. We can work with that figure as a starting point. Margaret had to sit down. Charles was frantically flipping through the geological surveys I'd placed on the table. Victoria just kept shaking her head in disbelief. Thomas, who'd been quiet until now, finally spoke up. I think my wife has demonstrated an excellent understanding of value, Mother. Though perhaps not the kind you recognize. Over the next 2 hours, we hammered out the preliminary terms of the deal. $250 million for the mineral rights, with a percentage of ongoing profits and a seat on the Regional Development Board. By the time Marcus Chen and his team left, the Wellingtons' world had shifted on its axis. The aftermath was interesting to watch. Charles suddenly discovered urgent business whenever I attended family functions. Margaret's garden party circle found new topics to whisper about. Victoria started calling me for investment advice. But the real changes were more fundamental. The Wellington family's old money was still old, but now they had to contend with new money that dwarfed their fortune. Money earned through the foresight of a mere ranch hand, and his granddaughter who refused to be bullied into selling. I used part of the proceeds to establish the Jack Chen Foundation for Educational Access, providing scholarships to students interested in geology and environmental science. The foundation's first office, right next door to the Wellington family business. Thomas finally declined his father's offer to join the family firm. Instead, we started our own investment company, focusing on undervalued properties and natural resources. Turns out my grandfather had research on a lot more than just that one parcel of land. Margaret still hosts her garden parties, but now she has to drive past the Jack Chen Foundation building to get to her favorite tea shop. The building's architecture is perhaps a bit more modern than she'd prefer for the neighborhood. The sign is perhaps a bit larger than strictly necessary. Last week, she called to invite me to tea. I suppose, she said stiffly, we should discuss the annual family photo. Your foundation's charitable work would make a lovely addition to the Wellington family's philanthropic image. I thought about it for a moment. That's a generous offer, Margaret. But I think the foundation's reputation is doing just fine on its own. Sometimes, I added, stirring my coffee, things work better when they're not part of the Wellington family portfolio. She flinched slightly, but nodded. Progress, of a sort. The worthless land is now a fully operational oil field. I visit regularly, standing on the property that my grandfather spent his life studying and protecting. The workers all know me, not as Mrs. Wellington of the Boston Wellingtons, but as Ms. Chen, the owner who understands the land and its value. In my office, I keep 2 things on my desk, the original deed to the worthless land and a photo of my grandfather. In the photo, He's standing in that same Texas desert, smiling like someone who knows something the rest of the world hasn't figured out yet. Next to it is a quote he loved. "The real value of anything is not what others tell you it's worth, but what you know it can become." Thomas and I are expecting our first child now. A girl. We're naming her Jacqueline after her great-grandfather. Margaret has finally stopped suggesting family names from the Wellington side. Sometimes, when I'm at the oil field, I walk to my grandfather's favorite spot, a high point overlooking the entire property. I think about the lessons he taught me, about patience, about knowing your worth, about letting others underestimate you until the perfect moment to prove them wrong. The land was never worthless, just like the people they look down on are never worthless. Sometimes the real value is hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone smart enough to see it and strong enough to defend it. Margaret still winces slightly when someone mentions the Chen property, but she's learned to hide it better, especially since the foundation's annual charity gala became the most prestigious event in town, even more so than her garden parties. As for that initial offer of $100,000, I had it framed. It hangs in my office, right next to the final sale contract for $250 million. A reminder that value, like respect, isn't given. Sometimes you have to stand your ground and wait for others to realize what you knew all along. Grandpa Jack would be proud.